If you've used a mover and now that mover is refusing to deliver your belongings, this is going to be incredibly stressful. It's a dire scenario for most. Now, a lot of people will instantly assume that the moving company is acting in bad faith, and in many cases, they might be right. But it also might surprise you to know this isn't always the case. So, what are the situations where this can occur, and more importantly, what can you do about it? When you sign an agreement with your mover, keep in mind that this is a legal contract. You need to understand the intent behind the paperwork and the details of what you're signing. Now, a good mover will try to explain every portion of that contract before you sign. However, some movers may intentionally or unintentionally skip this explanation, and that can inadvertently or deliberately create a situation where the moving company knows more about what will happen than you do. We refer to this as a gap of information between customers and the moving companies. Now, this gap shouldn't happen, but it sometimes does. To prevent it, learning beforehand everything you can about what will or what might occur during the move is essential. So if you have a mover withholding your belongings, this is an excellent example of a gap of information. To start, let's acknowledge that this is almost always a situation which occurs on long distance moves. Local moves, those less than 50 miles or so, those are typically delivered the day they're loaded, so this makes the possibility of movers withholding them pretty unlikely. But for long distance moves, this situation almost always comes down to payment. Now, the U.S. Department of Transportation regulates interstate moves, and from their guide entitled "The Rights and Responsibilities When You Move," we read the following. Your mover must issue you an honest and truthful freight or expense bill for each shipment transported. If you do not pay the charges due at the time of delivery, the mover has the right to refuse to deliver your shipment and to place it into storage at your expense until the bills are paid. Now, the regulations provide that when your mover arrives at destination, the mover may collect the charges due before the shipment is unloaded from the truck. So, what is required? Per those regulations that we just listed, movers can withhold your shipment delivery until you pay charges due. This is to prevent customers from scamming moving companies, which happens more than you might think. However, there is a limit to what your mover can charge you. So here's the details on that written for your protection. We'll continue reading from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Interstate Moving Guide. They say, when your shipment is delivered, you will be expected to pay either 100% of the charges on your binding estimate or up to 110% of the charges on your non-binding estimate. And you will also be requested to pay the charges for any services that you requested. Think about waiting time, extra pickup, delivery, or storages, after the contract with your mover was executed that were not included in the estimate, and also any charges for services performed in conjunction with impracticable operations, but not to exceed 15% of all charges due at delivery. Your mover will bill you after your shipment is delivered then for any remaining services. Okay, so based on that regulation, customers are required to pay something before their items are delivered. And in most cases, when this situation happens, it's customers disputing how much they owe. They feel the moving company is being unreasonable, tacking on additional unwanted charges. The problem is these disputes need to be resolved either before the shipment is loaded, or else you're going to need to pay 100% of the charges listed on a binding estimate, or up to 110% of the charges on a non-binding estimate, plus any services that you requested afterwards or came as a result of impracticable operations. If you don't do this, your movers can place your goods in storage until you pay the owed amount. Why is this required? Well, it's simply because the moving company incurs all the cost of the move at the time of loading and before delivery. So, moving companies come into a quandary. They prefer to get paid before conducting any work, but customers would rather pay after all the work is completed. It's a pretty big gap. So how would we proceed? Well, the government created a compromise to protect both sides and find a middle ground. And to enforce it, the process is listed in every interstate moving contract distributed to customers. And if you were to decide not to adhere to it, it might be costly, and nobody wants that. So what do? Now, if your mover has upheld their contractual obligation, you're going to need to pay the charges to get your belongings, and that is your contractual obligation. After paying, you'll then receive access to your items. But what about if you've done everything right? What do you do when you've upheld your contractual obligation and the movers still aren't delivering your belongings? This is common in two scenarios. Number one, new movers who do not understand the regulations, or scam movers who are trying to steal your belongings. Both cases are challenging and will likely require some level of arbitration or legal action. But before undergoing that legal action, try to work with the moving company. Have them explain to you, based on that rights and responsibilities document, where they believe you are failing your obligation. It might clear up a misunderstanding, but it becomes more difficult in cases of actual moving fraud. One of the most common is when a rogue mover provides a low-cost quote to perform an interstate move, then loads your goods onto the truck, and then claims your load is over the weight estimate and the additional weight will now need to be charged at an exorbitant price per pound. Consumers are forced to pay double or higher than the original estimate just to get their belongings back. If you want to know more about this, see our blog on avoiding moving scams. But in this situation, what do? Unfortunately, there's not typically much that can be done in the moment, as frustrating as that might be. Unless you can spur immediate law enforcement action, you may have to pay what is requested. And ultimately, you're the one who has to decide if that's what you want to do. But alternatively, with time, you might consider legal action to collect damages. We recommend consulting a lawyer for more information on how the process might work because we are not lawyers. But if you feel you have been the victim of fraud by a moving company or a moving broker, you can file a complaint with the FMCSA. They'll investigate your case and decide whether any laws have been broken. Your complaint might trigger a federal enforcement investigation against the mover, but your complaint will be entered into the FMCSA's National Consumer Complaint Database and will be used for analytical and statistical purposes. Now, in the end, the best way to avoid the situation is to understand your rights and your responsibilities before you move interstate. Understand the regulations and how they apply to you. The goal is to feel comfortable with the mover that you select. Feel comfortable that they have the experience, that they're trustworthy, and that they're capable of explaining everything that will or might happen during your move so that you can go into your loading day feeling prepared.